South Africa's Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says the continent cannot rely on China only for development.
Mboweni was speaking in Maseru, where he was addressing an association of accountants. The finance minister also commented on the state capture and the VBS saga.
Here's his full address at the 2018 annual conference of the Lesotho Institute of Accountants in Maseru.
Really, indeed, it's my pleasure and honor to have been invited to be here. You asked me to reflect on some of the challenges that face the African economy and how we probably situate the African economy within the global context. And I thought I'll make a few points only so that maybe we have a Q&A, which is much better. I think by now there is a general consensus amongst economists and policymakers that we need a few fundamental ingredients for economic growth and performance. And I'll just run through them. Macroeconomic stability, in particular the stability of the fiscal and monetary system. In this regard, the old rule of thumb that the budget deficit before borrowing should not be greater than 3% of GDP stays. But nevertheless, in times of stress, this can be tolerated at a slightly higher level. Monetary stability in terms of inflation, we should be kept at lower levels in order to continue to protect the value of the currency and the buying power of the poor in particular. I recall when I was governor of the bank, I used to have these running battles with COSATU. We were opposed to inflation targeting. And I was at pains to explain that higher inflation is bad for the working class because their buying power is reduced. And that lower inflation is actually beneficial to the working class because it protects the value of their currency. The rich really are not that bothered whether inflation is high or low. When inflation is high, they buy boats and private islands and aeroplanes and so on. And they can easily go and buy flats in London and New York, but the working class can't. They are stuck in the country. So monetary stability with inflation at a low level is key for the working class. Secondly, institutional stability is critical for growth, but also credibility. In this instance, let me make the example of a credible central bank as a key institution for economic performance. But side by side, there has to be a credible national treasury. An institution that's robust and staffed with people who would not stage regular heists against the national revenue. We normally think of heists only in terms of banks, but actually there are heists in national treasuries. More often than not to fund themselves or to fund political parties. Still. So that side-by-side credibility of the central bank and the national treasury is very important. And related to that as well is a credible revenue collecting agency. An agency which collects revenue without fear or favor and duly deposits the revenue with the National Treasury. One of the problems that I was going to mention later is the tendency by politicians to pressurize the revenue services to grant undue tax breaks to certain preferred business people. So business fellow goes to visit the Minister of Finance and says, these revenue people are giving me trouble about my returns. Can you do something about this? Minister of Finance phones the head of the Revenue Service and says, leave this Mr. Mohammed alone. So the revenue services needs to be credible. Thirdly, policy certainty. Governments need to introduce policies which are credible and certain, not changing all the time. Policies which change all the time tend to confuse economic agents and makes it difficult for business to plan medium to long term. Because today is this, tomorrow is that. You can't plan. Consistency, therefore, it's very important. Next is the fourth estate. Free, independent, and professional media. One which does not operate from a prejudice point of view. For example, in my case, these media people, soon after my appointment, they start saying, what debt can we find around him? Because his appointment has been well received by the markets and everybody else. So let's find some debt to spoil the party. So on Sunday, there'll be stories about girlfriend A, girlfriend B, maybe stole money at the Reserve Bank, maybe. Where exactly is his certificate from the National University of Lesotho? Maybe he doesn't have it. It recently happened by that one friend of mine, Kutwana. He said, where is your certificate? I had to write a testimonial to say, this fellow was with me at the university. We studied together. But that's what they do. So it's free, independent, but non-prejudiced media. That's what we need. They're irritating at times, actually more often than not. But let them do their work, but without prejudice. A strong and independent civil society. A civil society that questions public representatives and protects the interests of the people. The interests of the people are not protected only by the political parties, but by civil society. Next, this is the area that the Vice Chancellor is involved with, a functional human capital development program. A program that seeks to reinforce the economy, not one that continues to graduate the same people all the time, even when the economy has changed. Biblical studies all the time, humanities. So when the economy has changed, we need to change with the times. For example, has the technical human resources sphere in Lesotho changed to be in line with the emerging manufacturing sector in Lesotho at the technical level? Or are we going to forever depend on the Chinese? And what do our institutions do to catch up with the economy and diversify the employment pattern in Lesotho away from the civil service into industry? Lastly, technological penetration. Whether it's desktops, whether it's tablets, cell phones, and today, Wi-Fi. If there's no Wi-Fi, our young people won't go and work in a particular place. The first thing they do when they enter a restaurant, what is the Wi-Fi code? When they enter the university, Vice Chancellor, what is the Wi-Fi code? If Vice Chancellor, I don't have a Wi-Fi code, I'm not coming to study here. So the changes in technology. I mentioned these ingredients which we all know about, but which more often than not are ignored by policymakers when they rush to make certain ill-advised decisions. We know all of this. But on a daily basis, policymakers violate these principles and get us into serious trouble. So what is the general, this is a background which I'm using to make a few remarks on the African story. There are many good and bad things in sub-Saharan Africa. Let me start with the West thing. You know, our organization is the African Union. It's headquartered in Addis Ababa. The headquarters building was constructed by the Chinese, Holus Bulus. I'm now a minister, I suppose. I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm not here as a minister, by the way, so. I understand, this is not diplomatic, I understand that that building is bugged top to bottom, that all information flows somewhere. But worse than that, recently when I was in Addis Ababa, I noticed that the Chinese are also building the center where the African Union will keep its archives. So I wonder where the copies will go. We tried to, we being the African Union reforms team, tried to propose a number of changes to the way the African Union functions, working with Paul Kagame. And one of the things we proposed was that each African country must contribute 0.2% of its imports towards the financing of the African Union. The heads of states and government adopted that proposal. Come the foreign ministers and their diplomats in Addis Ababa, they resist everything. Particularly these ones in SADC. I told the minister that you people are difficult. And I'm told the charge could have been led by Botswana and Lesotho and Namibia. But South Africa being the coordinator, the president had to sign a collective letter opposing these reforms. In other words, SADC still wants the old dependency syndrome and not to be independent. But the minister tells me that something is changing, and I'll hold him to that. I'm giving this example of the African Union, which is our headquarters building, and it tells you something about the functioning of the continent. If your headquarters is in that state, then everything else that comes is bound to be a problem. I mean, for example, you have a macroeconomic capacity at the African Union, which is supposed to advise African governments on economic policy frameworks and economic development issues and so on. Most of the time, the senior staff of that directorate are not there in the office. Where are they? They're attending conferences at one place or the other. Why? Per diem. Per diem. So per diem. So when we try and find out why this per diem disease, we're told that there's no pension fund for the staff of the African Union. So to supplement. So, but there's a wrong way to do it. So the result is that the African Union still has an over-dependence on the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. They are the ones who do even photocopying of documents. So if that is the state of affairs at that level, then we have problems. Very big problems. Although there's been serious attempts at macroeconomic stabilization, but this was mostly forced by the IMF and the World Bank in the 70s and the 1980s. And that did a great deal of damage because it was not homegrown structural reforms. At the microeconomic level, if agriculture is still a major economic activity in Africa as it is, why is there such little investment in agriculture? And sometimes the issue is probably simple. How do we convince a young African to become a farmer when his counterparts are driving BMWs? Is he going to be able or she able to drive a BMW too? So we have to re-engineer the way we think about agriculture, not for subsistence, but as a business. And that's the approach that, wearing my hat as the chairman of the African Center for Economic Transformation, we're trying to push. Agriculture, agro-processing, and then improving the route to market. Because most of the time, the difficulty is that farmers are not able to take their produce to the market. And do the markets work? If the markets are not working, we need to improve those markets. But lots of things one took for granted, I think, over the years. But I think we've done better here at home. You know, in 1966, I think Prime Minister Jonathan used to say that the third road used to end up somewhere here. And then he used to say, no, up to Kuti. You might remember that. He meant the third road. But infrastructure development in Africa is very key to moving forward. And a lot of improvements have been made in Africa, but a lot of wastage has happened. And I think we need to pick up from where we are in terms of infrastructure, whether it's roads, rail, transport infrastructure, air transportation, so that we can get things moving, goods and services. One of the interesting things about Africa, by the way, Vice Chancellor, seems to be our inability to run airlines, which are key to transport, communications, and intra-African trade and so on. We don't seem to know how to run airlines. I don't know what's something African about it. I don't know. We can't run airlines. There's South African Airways too. We can't run it. So it's not just Lesotho Airways that collapsed. That one too is in serious trouble. We can't run airlines. You look at Zambia Airways is dead. Tanzania Airlines is dead. West Africa, the West African airline thing is dead. We can't run airlines. Maybe Vice Chancellor, I need to introduce a course on how to run an airline. And yet that's so critical to move people around, communication and so on, the key infrastructure. But we also, it seems we don't know how to run airports. An airport. I understand there's one African country where the Chinese built an airport for them. They've not been able to service the debt, and it looks like the Chinese are about to take the airport, which is very sad. Let me move out of infrastructure into the marginal tendency of Africans to promote conflict. The marginal tendency of Africans to promote conflict. There seems to be an aversion to peace in Africa, including here, at home. Yeah. Sometimes the relationship between the military and the civilian authority is undermined. South Sudan, people who used to be in the same movement, immediately after freedom, they don't see eye to eye. We splinter across and we start fighting. I was told the other day that the UN peacekeeping force has been in the DRC for over 50 years. So they're not there really to promote peace, because clearly the peace cannot be brought about in the DRC through the UN peacekeeping force. It's a political question, which requires a political solution. But these conflicts, as you know as accountants, these conflicts lead to the destruction of infrastructure, lead to the destruction of investments, drag us back in terms of economic performance. And we can only appeal to our leadership to really have the courage to confront political problems politically, not by military means. Right, let me come to a conclusion before you fall asleep. So is Africa going to rise? The answer is yes. I think there is emerging in different countries of Africa a crop of young leaders who understand economics and understand the needs of the people. They are young, but they are coming up. The bulk of the African population is young, although the leaders are old. And the old ones need to give way to the young ones. When I attended my first meeting of the African Union in Addis Ababa, and I saw the heads of states and government coming into the room, some they come with their medical doctors, carrying medical kits. And some come into the room with their military generals because they're afraid all the time. They need protection. uncertain about what's going to happen to them. So I was struck by the average age of the African leadership. If you see them in one room, you'll be very worried. Very, very worried. So during the break, I go to Paul Kagame, who's one of the young ones. I said, President, these people are old. So he says to me, you know, Governor, the problem is that you've been away for too long. This is what we're dealing with here. And during the course of the meeting, they fall asleep, some of them. And he said, but these are people leading a young population in Africa. Some of them are afraid to use a Wi-Fi. That's how. Now, they can't lead young people, these people. So I think we need young leadership. We need to promote global understanding. We need to use NEPAD more as a development agency. We need to have a strategic approach and relationship with the donor agencies for Africa's development and avoid the mindset of the big brother syndrome. We have to be steadfast in combating corruption, which eats huge amount of resources meant for Africa's development. Tongue-in-cheek, the other day, not knowing I was going to become Minister of Finance, I said, you know, the corruption in Africa is bad. Wherever there is a large project, rest assured there's massive corruption. So as accountants, always watch out when politicians introduce large projects. There's always something going to somebody's pocket, including the auditors as well. Including the auditors. So let me conclude then and say that Africa's economic development does rest to a large extent on whether we observe the fundamentals, whether we organize ourselves properly at the continental level, the regional level, and whether we build correct partnerships with our development partners and avoid corruption. Now, there have been 3 heists which have happened in South Africa recently. The first one was at Steinhoff, a large multinational South African company, where it seems, I must be very careful here, where it seems that the executives there created multiple structures of non-existent companies to boost the underlying value of the share price and occasionally sell their price to cash in. That's a heist. That's a heist. Daylight robbery. Incidentally, my own investment portfolio, personal investment portfolio, Steinhoff was about 5% of my investment portfolio. So I have a personal grudge against the heists. I lost a lot of money. The second one was what is called state capture in South Africa, where a group of entrepreneurs worked out a scheme where they first befriend the president. So be careful whoever befriends the prime minister, befriend the president, then start using his name to cascade down the state institutions and corrupt a whole layer of people and steal billions of rands in the process. State capture. It's a heist. Let's call it what it is. It's a heist. The third one, and very sad one, is called the Great Bank Heist, VBS. This was a bank that was started during the Bantustan system by the vendor Bantustan. The model was correct. This was a bank which is a mutual bank, which will accept deposits from the public and they will grant loans to people and provided loans, even housing loans to people living in so-called traditional areas, which the modern banks don't, because they say you don't have a title deed, you only have a permission to occupy from the chief. But this VBS was able to extend loans to those people. Then the executives began to use the bank as their personal property. And they looted it of 2 billion rand. And day before yesterday, we received the report about how they went about it. Very lavish lifestyles and so on. So the commissioner who did the investigation into the bank began his report by saying that many years ago there was a group of thugs who drilled a tunnel into Standard Bank in Krugersdorp. And they stole 400,000 rand. That's all they could find in the vaults. And they disappeared. And they were never arrested. He says this one. And then the ones who drilled the tunnel obviously did a lot of work, a lot of effort in going through the bank and underground into the bank. Huge amount of effort for 400,000 rand. So he says these ones, for little effort, they stole 2 billion rand and must go to jail. And I think it's correct. Thank you very much.